Hello, everyone. What is going on? Welcome back to The Murder Mindset. This is a podcast where we analyze true crime through the lens of neuroscience. My name is Deirdre. I'm your host. And if you are new to the podcast, I completed my graduate studies at Johns Hopkins, and I spent a lot of time analyzing how trauma, stress, grief, development alter the human brain. And I learned that a brain actually never breaks out of nowhere. It breaks slowly, invisibly, and often in plain sight. And that's what we are discussing. So let's go ahead and jump into today's episode. I'm going to give a trigger warning. This episode is really frustrating. I think all of the episodes that I talk about and cases are really frustrating. This episode is frustrating in particular because let's see, right now it's February 18th. This case is going to go to another trial on February 20th. I was going to release the episode on the 23rd, but I thought, you know what, for those of you that are actively following the case, let's release it early so you can watch this, follow the case, drop your thoughts. For those of you that are new here and that are watching on YouTube, I do a lot of research. I'm going to be referencing a lot of meta-analysis studies. So I'm going to be looking down. For those of you that are wondering, like, what am I looking at? That's what I'm looking at. Also, for those of you that are listening only, don't forget to follow me on Instagram because I post all of the case breakdowns after every episode. So you can see everyone involved in the case, the individuals, the survivors, the suspects, the location, just details. So you can kind of put the visual to the audio. So let's go ahead and jump into it, okay? So there's a part of your brain and it's called the prefrontal cortex. It sits right behind your forehead and it's responsible for essentially everything that you, your ability to plan, your ability to weigh consequences, to pause before you act, to imagine a future and make decisions that serve it. It is the seat of impulse control, of emotional regulation, of irrational thought under pressure. And every time you stop yourself from saying something that you would regret or think through a decision before making it, that is your prefrontal cortex actually doing its job. And here's what most people don't know about the prefrontal cortex. It's not finished developing until you're approximately 25 years old. So that means for the first 2.5 decades of your life, you are walking around with the most critical piece of your decision-making architecture still under construction. And that is actually the timeline for a brain that grew up in a safe, healthy, and stable environment. If you did not grow up in a safe, healthy, or stable environment, that timeline is going to be altered. And today we're going to be talking about a girl from Des Moines, Iowa. And I want to tell you the way that this case actually happened from the beginning because the brain is the thorough line to everything in this story. And if you don't understand what was happening inside of her brain, this case is not going to make sense to you the way that it should. So let's go ahead and dive into it. So Pieper Lewis, she was born around 2004 in Des Moines, Iowa. The very first chapter of her life was already marked in crisis because just days after she was born, she was actually returned to the hospital severely malnourished. She was a newborn baby who wasn't being fed. She was removed by authorities and placed into the foster system. And she was eventually adopted by a couple named Billy and Leslie Lewis. They did separate in 2019, and then Pieper went on to live with her adoptive mother, Leslie. Pieper's own account, she said that this was a deeply unhealthy living arrangement. She said that she endured mistreatment, verbal abuse, and by her early teens, she had actually become a repeat runaway. And that phrase, repeat runaway, gets used in police reports and court documents like it is a behavioral problem, like it's evidence of defiance or delinquency. In reality, running away is actually one of the most reliable indicators we have that a child is experiencing abuse or neglect at home. So when a child runs away once, it might be impulsive, but when a child is running away repeatedly, something in that home is fundamentally unsafe, and the child's nervous system knows it before they can even articulate it. So for Pieper, that pattern, unfortunately, went all the way back to her first days of life. She entered the world malnourished and was removed from the people who were supposed to care for her. That early disruption, even before conscious memory forms, leaves a neurological imprint. So research on early adverse experiences has shown that infants who experience neglect in the first months of life can develop altered attachment patterns and heightened sense of stress reactivity that persists into childhood and adolescence. So for Pieper, this foundation was shaky before she could even hold her head up. We know that the brain actually doesn't experience chaos abstractly. It responds to it in ways that are physical and structural. And in a child, those responses have lasting consequences. So there's a system called the HPA axis, which stands for the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And its entire job is to manage your stress response. When you perceive a threat, your hypothalamus signals your pituitary gland, which signals your adrenal glands to respond to danger. It raises your blood sugar, sharpens your cardiovascular system, suppresses non-essential functions like digestion and immune response, and it prepares you for flight or flee. It is a beautifully designed system, and it's meant to activate in short bursts and then shut back down through a negative feedback loop. In simple terms, stress fires, your body responds, and then it resets. That is how it is supposed to work. But when a child is living in a home where that threat is chronic, where the source of danger is supposed to be the source of safety, that feedback loop breaks. And this is a common theme and pattern that we have discussed almost on every single episode that I have done so far. So the HPA axis doesn't get to reset. And we have substantial research actually backing this up. So a massive meta-analysis published in the Neuroscience and Behavioral Reviews in 2025 synthesized 129 studies and found that childhood adversity is significantly associated with dysregulated cortisol patterns, meaning the alarm system either gets stuck or it is blaring at all times, or it burns out completely and stops responding to danger altogether. So both of those outcomes change how the brain develops. What this means in real life is that a child like Pieper wasn't just stressed. Her brain's entire threat management architecture was being rewired around the reality of never being safe, which is just so heartbreaking and really upsetting. And here's where it gets really important, because it's not just the stress response that takes the hit, it's the part of your brain that is supposed to help you manage it. A 2024 review in Metabolic Brain Disease looked specifically at what chronic cortisol exposure actually does to the developing brain, and what they found matters for understanding kids like Pieper. Chronically elevated cortisol does real damage to the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for control, right? Decision making, emotional regulation. And when that prefrontal cortex is compromised, it loses the ability to keep the amygdala in check. So again, the amygdala is your brain's fear and threat detection center. And in a child living under chronic stress, it is actually running the show. So what you end up with is a brain where the fear center is hyperactive and the control center is underwater. And that is not a character flaw or a behavioral choice. It is the predictable neurological consequence of growing up in an environment that never felt safe. This is really interesting because when I got into true crime a few years ago and I would listen to cases, I was constantly like, why and how does this happen? Like, why aren't we talking about their childhood? And let me be clear, you can go through a very stressful childhood and obviously live a very quote unquote normal life, but it is highly likely that those who are experiencing chronic stress, I'm not even going to say it's highly likely because it just is what it is. We've analyzed and looked at functional MRIs. Those who go through chronic stress, their brain develops differently. The choices and reactions that they have as adolescents are different than those who have not gone through these kind of childhoods. And when I first started listening to true crime, that was kind of like that common link that I had heard in a lot of cases. Unfortunately, people grew up in homes of abuse, neglect, substance abuse, and they were reacting to the environment that they were in. They were a product of their environment, obviously. And then they go out and, do things. And a lot of times children, when they're growing up in these environments, they're labeled as bad kids, defiant kids. They're labeled as the troublemakers. And I think it was just recently, when I say recently, I mean in like the past 5 to 10 years recently, where people started to kind of look at, child psychologists started to look at behavior analysis, started to look, what is the environment of these children? Because I think this was a known thing, for a while. but it has become more, when I say recent, I mean it recently has become more mainstream. And I don't mean let's blame our parents and, a child is acting out and, it's not the child's fault. Like obviously the child, there's kind of like that fine line where you can become a product of your environment and then you get to the point where you recognize your environment and then you do something to change it, right? But a lot of times we do really have to understand that when children, their brains are developing and they are in environments like this, it will negatively affect their entire life. And I cannot preach that enough because I just think that it's so important and it seems so obvious, I think, in today's day and age with social media. These are conversations that we have a lot. They seem very obvious, but they're not. So this is the context for everything that Pieper did next: the running away, the gravitating toward outside relationships, the inability to tolerate a home that felt threatening. And none of that is random. It tracks exactly with what we know about how chronic early adversity shapes the developing brain. So by March of 2020, Pieper was 15 years old and she had run away again. This time she did not come back. She ended up sleeping in the hallways of apartment buildings. She was alone. She didn't have a caseworker. She had no shelter placement, no safety net of any kind. She was a child living in a hallway, essentially, with no system intervening. So when a teenager who already has a dysregulated nervous system ends up in an environment of total instability, like no consistent shelter, no food security, no adult protection, the brain doesn't just stay at its current level of dysregulation, it actually escalates. The HPA axis is now responding to constant, unpredictable environmental threats on top of the relational threats that were already encoded. So sleep deprivation, which is virtually guaranteed when you're sleeping in a hallway, further impairs that prefrontal cortex and amplifies amygdala reactivity. In plain terms, a brain that was already struggling to feel safe was now operating almost entirely from its survival circuits with very little higher order thinking available. And this is the brain that a man named Christopher Brown found. Christopher was 28 years old. He was a musician and he told Pieper that he would take care of her. He gave her a place to stay, and then he began trafficking her. He forced her to have sex with him first, and then he started posting her on dating sites and selling her to other men in exchange for money and drugs. And the language of court documents sanitizes what that actually means, because trafficking sounds like a legal category. What it actually means is that a grown man looked at a homeless 15-year-old child and saw an opportunity to make money by selling her body. He used the one thing that she desperately needed, which was shelter, stability, the feeling that someone was going to take care of her on a deeper level, and he used that as leverage to exploit her. And from a neuroscience perspective, this is exactly what a trauma-compromised adolescent brain is most vulnerable to. We know that the adolescent brain is in a period of heightened sensitivity to social reward. Teenagers are neurologically wired to seek connection, approval, and belonging. And in a healthy environment, this drives them toward peer groups, mentors, and activities. But in an environment where a teenager has been deprived of safe attachment and is literally sleeping in a hallway, that same reward sensitivity makes them profoundly vulnerable to anyone who offers warmth, shelter, and the appearance of care. When we later see Pieper staying, complying, and not running, this isn't weakness. This is exactly what this kind of brain adaptation predicts. And once the coercive control begins, the brain adapts to that too, and not in ways that make escape any easier. Chronic sexual violence, particularly in adolescence, produces measurable changes in brain structure and function. So research published in Frontiers in Psychiatry has found that abuse experienced between the ages of 14 and 16 specifically affect the development of the prefrontal cortex, which is the exact region that was already under-resourced in Pieper's brain from her childhood, right? Neuroimaging studies on childhood sexual abuse survivors have found increased activation in the insular cortex, which is involved in bodily awareness, fear, anticipation, and altered activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, which plays a role in emotional regulation. So what this means in real life is that the brain is remodeling itself around that reality of sustained violation, and what it builds is a nervous system that is perpetually braced for threat, even when the immediate threat is not perceived. This is key in the case. Pieper stated that her trafficker forced her at knife point to go to apartments of the men he sold her to. And one of those men was Zachary Brooks. Zachary Brooks was 37 years old. 37 years old. Pieper was 15. He was a bus driver and he was a father. And whatever else is true about what happened in that apartment, his children lost their dad. That is real and that does matter. And nothing else in this episode is meant to erase that. But what is also true and what prosecutors have not disputed is, according to Pieper's account, Brooks raped her at least 5 times over the weeks that followed. He kept her drugged. He kept her inundated with alcohol. She was 15. Each of those assaults sent another flood of cortisol through a system that was already dysregulated. Each one further compromised the prefrontal cortex's ability to plan, to strategize, to imagine a future. Each one strengthening the amygdala's conviction that the world was not safe and that no one was coming to help. There's actually a term in neuroscience. It's called disassociation, and it's one of the brain's most powerful protective mechanisms. If you are someone who has listened to true crime for a while, you're probably really familiar with this term. So when the body is being violated, and there's no possibility of escape, the brain essentially leaves. It detaches from the sensory experience of what is happening. And in simple terms, when you can't fight and you can't flee, the brain actually finds a third option. It checks out. So neuroimaging research has shown that dissociation is associated with altered activation in the insula, which normally processes internal bodily states in the anterior cingulate cortex, which helps to regulate emotional responses. A meta-analysis of PTSD found that people with PTSD exhibit hyperactivation of the amygdala and the insula, the fear and the body awareness centers, along with hypoactivation of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is involved in emotional regulation and extinguishing fear responses. Wow, that was a mouthful. So basically, in people who dissociate, the brain shows decreased insula activation, as though it has turned down the volume on bodily awareness entirely, and increased medial prefrontal cortex activation, as though the brain is trying to override this experience from the top down. So when we see survivors kind of feeling like they weren't in their own body, that's actually not a figure of speech. That is a measurable neurological event. So what this means for Pieper is that over the course of weeks of repeated rape, her brain was toggling between 2 states: hyperarousal, in which every sensory input was amplified and processed as threat, and dissociation, in which her brain pulled the plug on bodily awareness entirely to survive the unsurvivable. Neither of these states is compatible with the kind of calm, rational, consequence weighing decision making that the legal system would later demand of her. And on May 31st, 2020, according to her plea agreement, the man who trafficked her confronted her with a knife and forced her to go to Zachary Brooks' apartment. She was made to drink vodka, and Brooks raped her again. She then fell asleep or lost consciousness. The record isn't entirely clear. And then he also fell asleep. And then she woke up. And in her own words from the plea agreement, she was overcome with rage at the realization that he had raped her again. She grabbed a knife from the nightstand beside the bed and she stabbed Zachary Brown more than 30 times. So this is the moment that the legal system cares about. This is the moment that prosecutors build their case around. And this is where neuroscience becomes critical and becomes extremely important. The question that the courtroom asks was she in immediate danger? And the answer, according to prosecutors, was no, because Brooks was asleep. But the question reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how a traumatized brain processes threat. Because in a brain that has not been subjected to chronic trauma, threat assessment happens through a calibration between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. The amygdala detects potential danger and sends an alert, and the prefrontal cortex evaluates that alert. Is this a real threat? Is it imminent? And what are my options? Like, what are the consequences of each option, right? And then modulates the response. And this is the process that allows a healthy adult brain to distinguish between he's asleep right now, I can leave, I'm in danger. But Pieper, as we know, and as we have just discussed, her prefrontal cortex was not functioning like a healthy adult brain, the brain of a 15-year-old. And remember what we talked about when we opened this episode, the region of her brain is still a decade away from full maturation of her age. And on top of that, developmental reality has been battered by an abusive home, by weeks of sustained cortisol, being flooded from being trafficked, by repeated sexual assaults. The American Psychological Association has weighed in on this. this in guidance that the United States Supreme Court found compelling enough to cite in 3 separate landmark rulings, which was Roper versus Simons, Graham versus Florida, and Miller versus Alabama. The court acknowledged that the adolescent brain simply does not give young people the same degree of control over behavior that the adult brain does. The regions responsible for judgment and impulse control are not fully online yet. That's not an option. That is literally science that shaped the constitutional law. So why was that not being brought up during this case? And again, this is not just any adolescent brain. This was an adolescent brain that was in active crisis. So when Pieper woke up in that apartment, her nervous system was not performing a rational threat assessment. Her amygdala had been registering Zachary as lethal threat for weeks because obviously he was one. He was asleep, and in that specific moment, it did not change the neurological reality that her brain had encoded him as an ongoing threat. Right? So the rage that Pieper described is consistent with what trauma researchers call a survival violence response, which is fundamentally different from premeditated violence. Premeditated violence involves significant prefrontal cortex engagement, so like planning, deliberation, weighing consequences. Survival violence is subcortical, which means it originates in the amygdala and the deeper limbic structures. It is the brain's last resort program when every single other option like freeze, flee, submit, dissociate has been exhausted. The system decides that the only remaining path to survival is to eliminate the threat. The number of stab wounds, more than 30, is actually consistent with this kind of amygdala-driven response because it doesn't indicate cold-blooded calculation. It indicates a nervous system that has fully discharged into survival mode, a brain that has flooded with adrenaline and is acting without prefrontal modulation. So again, the courtroom calls that murder, but the brain calls it the last thing that it knew how to do. So Pieper Lewis was arrested and she was initially charged with first-degree murder. And again, she was 15 years old. Something else that shapes every single part of how Pieper's case was handled, and it's not separate from the neuroscience. It is embedded in it. So Georgetown Law's Center on Poverty and Inequality published a landmark study in 2017 called Girlhood Interrupted: The Erasure of Black Girls' Childhood. Researchers Rebecca Epstein, Jamelia Blake, and Thalia Gonzalez found that adults perceive Black girls as less innocent and more adult-like than white girls of the same age, with the peak disparity appearing in girls between 5 and 14 years old. So compared to white girls, Black girls were perceived as needing less nurturing, less protection, less support, and less comfort. A follow-up study in 2019 confirmed this through focus groups with Black women and girls across the country, with one participant saying it plainly: to society, we are not innocent, and white girls are always innocent. So what that means in practice is that the same brain, the same trauma response, the same survival behaviors gets read completely differently depending on who it belongs to. The data backs this up on a systemic level. Nationally, Black girls are suspended from school more than 5 times as often as white girls. They are 2.7 times more likely to be referred to the juvenile system than their white peers. And this is adultification bias, and it means that when a 15-year-old Black girl shows up in the criminal justice system, the adults in that system are statistically less likely to see her as a child, less likely to extend the benefit of the doubt, and more likely to treat her as a fully capable adult. The neuroscience does not exist in a vacuum. It gets filtered through a system that was never designed to see her clearly. So that is what we are seeing in this case, like plainly. So Pieper eventually pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter and willful injury, both of which carried up to 10 years in prison. And in September of 2022, Judge David Porter deferred the 20-year prison sentence and placed her on 5 years of close supervised probation. He ordered 1,200 hours of community service, GPS monitoring, residency at the Fresh Start Women's Center in Des Moines. And because Iowa law mandates it and the judge said he had no discretion, $150,000 in restitution to Zachary Brooks's family. Like, I'm sorry, what? She had to pay Zachary Brooks's family, the man who repeatedly raped her, the 37-year-old man, $150,000 as a 15-year-old. So by the time of this, Pieper was 17, and in her statement to the court, she said that day a combination of complicated actions took place, resulting in the death of a person as well as a stolen innocence of a child. She said, "To say there is only one victim in this story is absurd." The prosecutor took issue with that and said that she failed to take responsibility. I am literally screaming right now. Do you guys hear this? She said that day the innocence of a child was stolen, and the prosecutor looked at that sentence and said, "You are not taking responsibility." The judge then told her that the next 5 years of her life would be full of rules that she disagreed with and asked her repeatedly if she could follow them. Her former high school teacher, Leland Shipper, set up a GoFundMe that raised over $400,000 within days. And it says on the GoFundMe, a child who was raped under no circumstances should owe the family's rapist money. But the money didn't fix what was already breaking. There are two things that are both true at the same time here. So Pieper Lewis violated her probation multiple times, and a trafficking survivor's brain makes compliance with structured supervision extraordinarily difficult. These two things are not in conflict, they are cause and effect. After sentencing, Pieper was placed at the Fresh Start Women's Center. She was the youngest person there, surrounded by women with what she described as criminal lifestyles. She had a GPS ankle monitor, she had a curfew, she had rules about where she could go and when. And this is the part that blows my mind. The center was located 1 mile away from where she had been trafficked. 1 mile away from where she had been trafficked. She had later said that a member of Zachary Brooks's family had heckled her at a bus stop. She said that she bumped into her former trafficker, Christopher Brown, the man who sold her, the man who has actually never been charged. Every single one of these violations tracks into the diagnostic profile of complex PTSD as defined by the ICD-11. So complex PTSD is distinct from standard. So complex PTSD is distinct from standard PTSD, and it develops specifically in response to prolonged repeated trauma from which escape is difficult or impossible, which is a textbook description of sex trafficking. It includes 3 core disturbances beyond regular PTSD symptoms. One is persistent difficulty with emotional regulation, 2, a negative and distorted self-concept, and 3, disturbances in relationships, particularly with authority figures and systems of external control. In plain terms, it is a disorder that makes the exact conditions of probation feel like a continuation of the trauma, like not a path out of it, especially like the location. The fact that she ran into her trafficker and members of Zach's family, I just, like, if you have done or are familiar with any research on complex trauma like PTSD, this is actually really heartbreaking. Like, this is heartbreaking for a survivor to just continually be re-traumatized. And it's not an opinion. Again, there is neuroscience to back this up. So in November of 2022, less than 2 months after her sentencing, Pieper cut off her GPS monitor, walked out of Fresh Start Women's Center, and disappeared. She was found a few days later, and she said that she had gone to a mall because she wanted a sense of normalcy. She was 18 years old, and most of her teenage years had been spent in detention facilities. The judge called this her second chance and warned her that there would not be a third. She was sent to Georgia in November of 2023 to a residential treatment facility called House of Cherith, and by March of 2024, she had been kicked out for what the facility called several violations of the house rules. In April of 2024, she was removed from another Atlanta treatment center, and in May, she actually failed to show up to probation meetings, and the Iowa Department of Corrections issued a nationwide arrest warrant. She was gone. For 18 months, no one knew where she was. And here's why this matters, because this would be really easy to look at this list of violations and see a pattern of defiance, right? The system certainly did that, but what the research tells us is actually something very different. So when a trafficking survivor, like I said, is placed in a system of surveillance, confinement, and monitored movement, their nervous system does not interpret that like the way the court intends it to. The court intends structure, accountability, rehabilitation, but the brain of a trafficking survivor has spent months or years learning one fundamental lesson: when someone else controls your body and your movement, you are in danger. The GPS monitor does not feel like accountability. It feels like a tether. The curfew, it doesn't feel like structure. It feels like captivity. And the residential facility doesn't feel like support. It feels like another room that you're not allowed to leave. So Pieper's brain wasn't choosing defiance. It was executing a survival program. So cut the monitor, leave the building, get away from the thing that feels like captivity. And the system's response to each violation was tighten control, which is exactly the wrong intervention for a brain in this state. Because like I said, increased restriction increases the activation of the salience network, which increases the perception of threat, which increases the drive to escape. It's like a feedback loop that the criminal justice system has no mechanism to interpret because it was never designed for brains like hers, but it really should be. So on December 19th, 2025, after 18 months off the grid, Pieper walked into Polk County Jail and turned herself in. She was 21 years old. Her attorney said that during those 18 months, she actually sought treatment on her own. She said that she connected with community service providers and medical professionals, and they actually have records and witnesses who will show that she made progress and accepted responsibility for what she did. She has stipulated to 3 probation violations. She's not denying that she broke the rules, but she is contesting disposition, which means that she's asking the court to reconsider what should happen next rather than automatically imposing the 20-year sentence that has been hanging over her head since she was 17. So her contestant hearing is scheduled February 20th, 2026 in front of the same judge, David Porter, who told her that she was getting her second chance and would not get a third. If the judge revokes her probation, Pieper could spend the next 20 years in prison. She'd be 41 when she's eligible to get out. And so the question that is going to be in the courtroom on February 20th is fundamentally a question about what we believe a brain can do and what we believe it deserves, because the neuroscience is not ambiguous. The Supreme Court has acknowledged in 3 separate rulings that adolescent brains are fundamentally different from adult brains, that their capacity for impulse control, consequence assessment, and emotional regulation is different. The research on chronic trauma and HPA axis dysregulation has established that sustained adversity in childhood reshapes a brain's stress architecture in measurable, lasting ways. We know that the literature on complex PTSD has documented that the behavioral patterns trafficking exhibit after their exploitation, the difficulty with authority, the fight from confinement, the inability to comply with structured control, are not choices. They are symptoms of the very disorder that the trafficking caused. Pieper Lewis was a child who was failed by every single system that existed to protect her. She was failed by a home that was supposed to be safe. She was failed by the child welfare system that never intervened when a 15-year-old was living in a hallway. She was failed by law enforcement that never investigated the man who trafficked her to this day and has never charged him with a crime. And he's probably out there still trafficking other people. And yes, Zachary Brooks's children lost their father. This is also true. There is grief on both sides of the story, and acknowledging one does not erase the other. But what I can't stop thinking about and what I keep coming back to is that prefrontal cortex that we started with, the one that is not finished developing until 25, the one that gets damaged by chronic stress, the one that was already compromised before Pieper was even old enough to drive, because before she had any of the tools, a developing brain needs to navigate the world safely. And we know what trauma does to the brain. We have the research, we have the imaging, we have the literal Supreme Court rulings. The question is not whether we understand it. The question is what we choose to do with that understanding, and whether we are willing to build systems that account for the brains that we actually have rather than the ones that we wish people had. What does it say about us, about the systems that we have built, when the most predictable outcome of a traumatized brain is treated as evidence of its guilt? I am going to end the episode on that question. Drop your comments below, your thoughts. As always, like, comment, subscribe, share with anyone that you think might be interested in this case. And yeah, it will be interesting to see what happens on the 20th. As always, thank you guys so much for listening. I will see you guys next time.